Battleship Potemkin, Stalker, and Come and See are some of the most internationally acclaimed films to have ever come out of the Soviet Union. But that's not what the average Soviet moviegoer wanted to watch after a hard day's work in a collective farm or the local nuclear plant. People wanted escapism. So whenever they ran out of samagon, they would go to the cinema. And what better way to escape from your everyday life than watching a western? Wait, not a western, I mean an eastern. Believe it or not, the Soviet Union had its own version of this quintessentially American genre, and that's what it was called. They certainly borrowed a number of things that we associate with westerns, like spacious landscapes, horse riding, gunfights, and even train robberies. But other things had to be adapted. In fact, the stories were set in Central Asia right at the end of the Russian Civil War, which represented an unconquered frontier the same way the West was in the US. Native Americans were replaced by Islamist rebels called Basmachi, who resisted Soviet expansion and were portrayed as barbaric, lawless tribes that still hung on to outdated traditions. In the Western, the main character is often a lone wolf who brings justice to the lawless towns of the Wild West by himself. But an individualist hero doesn't work in a communist country. Because of that, the protagonist of the Eastern is usually a Red Army soldier who puts his service to the nation above all else for the expansion of communism.
Так что ноги мои бегут теперь по горячим пескам в обратную сторону, потому как долг революционный к тому нас обязывает.
But some Soviet westerns were actually set in the American Wild West, which made up its own subgenre called the Red Western. These were usually adapted from short stories or novels by American writers like Jack London, Thomas Mayne Reid, or O. Henry, who all criticized the American system in some way or another, and that's why their work was so popular in the Soviet Union. As far as I know, only two Red Westerns weren't adaptations. A Man from the Boulevard, the Capucines, and the animated short Once Cowboy, Twice Cowboy. So, how did all of this begin in the first place? Well, for that we have to thank our dear comrade Stalin, because in between one atrocity and another, he also needed to let off steam and was a massive film buff. In fact, he watched movies almost every evening, and when he watched foreign films, the Soviet Minister of Cinematography Ivan Bolshakov would translate them on the spot for him. Amongst the films that Stalin enjoyed most of all were westerns, and arguably the first Eastern, called The 13, was commissioned by him and based on John Ford's The Lost Patrol. I say arguably the first Eastern because there were prior attempts, like, most notably, Red Devils in 1923, based on a novel with the same name by Pavel Blyakhin. Even though it already displayed some comparable aspects with westerns, it doesn't yet establish the tropes of the Eastern that everyone would be familiar with. Over 40 years after this film came out, another one was based on the same source material under the title The Elusive Avengers. It was so successful that it even span out two sequels and started the resurgence of the Eastern in the 70s, the decade that produced the most memorable examples of the genre. In fact, White Son of the Desert, which came out just a few years after The Elusive Avengers, had such a huge impact on Soviet and Russian pop culture that many lines from it are still quoted to this day.
Тебя как, сразу прикончить? Или желаешь помучиться?
Лучше, конечно, помучиться.
The rebirth of the Eastern in the late 60s might have also been thanks to the enormous success of The Magnificent Seven by John Sturges, which was one of the few westerns ever allowed to the USSR thanks to the approval of Stalin's successor Nikita Khrushchev. Aside from that, Soviet filmmakers had access to more foreign films than the average Soviet citizen thanks to the film festivals that they attended. That's how some of them discovered spaghetti westerns like Sergio Leone's Dollars trilogy and were inspired by their iconic imagery for their own work. The films that I mentioned so far were Russian productions. So, what about the other Soviet republics? Well, studios in Central Asia like Uzbek Film and Tajik Film made their own Easterns too. The protagonists were usually locals, as it was the case in The Seventh Bullet, where Kyrgyz actor Suymenkul Chokmarov is a Red Army soldier looking for a warlord whom his soldiers deserted to. But in other examples like The Bodyguard, the ethnically Central Asian protagonist Mirza is portrayed by Alexander Kaidanovsky and the antagonist Sultan Nazar by Anatoly Solenitsyn, who were actually Russian actors and Tarkovsky's frequent collaborators. Like you might have guessed, these films are all focused on the fight of the Soviets against the remaining rebels of Central Asia, just like in the Russian Easterns. The Bodyguard is probably the most unique example I've seen, because the protagonist is not the typical Russian Red Army soldier, but just a local hunter who uses his knowledge of his native territory to bring the Sultan to justice across the mountains. The films of this second period of the Eastern were a bit different from those that established the genre, and that's why I think they're so much more interesting to look at. In fact, they don't show the Russian Civil War the same way anymore. These films feel a lot grittier and personal because there's so much more emphasis on the suffering and desires of the characters. They're not just unstoppable Red Army machines anymore. In White Sun of the Desert, the protagonist wants to finish his mission to go back to his wife, who often appears in his dreams and is the recipient of his letters.
А еще скажу вам, разлюбезная Екатерина Матвеевна, что являетесь вы мне, будто чистый лебедь.
In The Bodyguard, the protagonist just wants to go back to his mother and finish building her house once he's able to bring the Sultan to justice.
Это твои. Наш дом сожгли. Никак не могу матери новый достроить.
By contrast, in a film like The 13, we don't know anything about any of the characters' past lives, except what we can assume by their accents or physical appearance. All of them are exclusively focused on their mission of capturing yet another Basmachi leader. Also, in the Easterns of the 70s, the revolution is not tackled with the same enthusiasm anymore, or at least it feels that way, because it's shown as a distant and nostalgic past that has been stifled by the bureaucracy of post-Civil War Soviet Union. Take At Home Among Strangers, A Stranger Among His Own, for instance. The film starts with black and white footage of a bunch of enthusiastic Russian soldiers celebrating with joyful music in the background, until we cut abruptly to a gloomy, dark and quiet office where some of the same soldiers are sitting silently. They are tired of the bureaucracy that they have to deal with and miss the glory days of the revolution.
Не могу больше!
Fortunately for them, a train robbery occurs where gold that is being transported to Moscow is stolen by Russian and Basmachi rebels.
Я золотишко собрал, приготовил, а ты все себе захапал.
And the Red Army soldiers finally have their chance to get out and kick some ass. Aside from that, the rest of the film puts a lot of emphasis on the heroic efforts of the soldiers to bring the gold back for the collective good of the nation. But the recurrent flashbacks, and especially the start of the film, mirrors the state of the Soviet Union at the time the film was made, while still glorifying communism and the heroic patriotism of the Red Army soldiers to please censors. Even though the Eastern and Red Western subgenres died off with the collapse of the Soviet Union, they still teach us a lot about the country's history. Just like the evolution of the American Western mirrored US history across the decades, so did the Eastern in the USSR. It was precisely the way the Russian Revolution was remembered, and especially the way this memory changed through time in Soviet cinema, that reveals a lot about the country without ever criticizing it explicitly. But besides this historically significant aspect, many Easterns and Red Westerns are still very entertaining to watch if you don't mind some communism sprinkled here and there, and I strongly recommend that you check them out. I'll put my list of recommended films in the description of this video. Please don't forget to subscribe and like this video if you enjoyed it.